What did the faith of Abraham look like? Yesterday, we were talking about Abraham's faith, and basically, faith is faith. I mean, this whole series is having end time faith, but if you're going to have end time faith, we might as well be looking where it started and look at the person who was our example for it. Today, we're going to be looking at some of the things that the faith of Abraham, some of the attributes that the faith of Abraham has. This is John Dowler of Prayer Builders in Winona, Minnesota, and today we are in Romans chapter 4, and these are some of my favorite verses to teach on in faith. They aren't actually going to say too much, but I really believe in these verses. If you want to try to strip faith right down to the bare essentials, what is faith? What are the things I should be doing and shouldn't be doing? I think these verses. I think these verses just speak volumes, and I mean, I know out there's all kinds of, right now you could Google on YouTube you could Google on Google and find all these books and find all these teachings on faith. I mean, enough of them that would wear you out, and a lot of them have formulas and they have all these things. We need to strip this down to be as simple as possible, and have it so you got a handle to grab onto, and you can know how to do some things. So I want to go ahead and look at this, and let's just go ahead and start reading here in Romans chapter 4 and at verse 16. It says, "Therefore it is of faith that it might be by grace to the end of the promise, that it might be sure to all the seed, not only to them which is of the law, but also those which is of the faith of Abraham, who's the father of us all." Now, we were looking at this yesterday, how Abraham was the father of us all. I mean, he was the father of us all with the covenant, naturally speaking and spiritually speaking. He's the one God cut this covenant of the new birth with, that it was gonna end up coming to pass. And then, look at this. Now, these are quoting back out of the book of Genesis, but it says in verse 17, and this is what God had said to Abraham. It says, "As it is written, I have made you a father of many nations, before whom he believed, even God, who quickens the dead and calls those things which are not as though they were." Now, what was really amazing about this is before Abraham had any children, God changed his name, and God started calling him something that he wasn't. And he was Abram. But then he made him Abraham, and that word, that new name, when he changed his name, Abraham literally changed his name. And I mean, right now, I think it's actually pretty common these days. I mean, for whatever reason, I think it's more common for people to be changing their names legally to something else. I think it happens right now a lot more than it ever used to. But Abraham changed his name. And when he changed his name and began to call himself what God called him, every time he was coming to a new place or meeting people and introducing himself, he was reaching out and shaking their hand and saying, "I'm the father of many nations." And he didn't have any kids. He didn't have any kids. That's what he was saying. Well, why was he saying that? He was saying that because that's what God said. God said, you're the father of many nations. And it didn't make sense. But once he took that name, there was no turning back. That was going to be his name till the day he died. I mean, if he wouldn't have had kids for the next 30 years, that was going to be his name. He would have been walking around saying that. And I don't know, there had to be some people mocking him probably at times, hearing him saying such a thing. But what I wanted to do, and look at this, down in verse 17, he says, "I've made you a father of many nations, before whom he believed, even God, who quickens the dead and calls those things which are not as though they were. Now look at this. Our God quickens the dead. There can be times in these last days, there could be stuff that seemed like it died out. I mean, there's been all kinds of businesses that died in the last 2 years. There's been all kinds of death working in so many areas. I mean, we've had so many. There's been over 1 million United States citizens die, COVID related, in the last couple years. There has been so much death. Well, I want you to know that we serve a God, that he is the God that he can quicken the dead. Anything that's dying, he can raise it back up again. And faith is the thing. Being persuaded of what God has said is the key to our whole lives. Being persuaded. But before you can be persuaded of what he said, you got to know what he said. You got to get into this and look at it. Now I want to go down here, and these are the verses that I really wanted to get into. Let's just go ahead and read here. I'm gonna read down through here, and I want to get down to verse 19. But down here at verse, let's go ahead and read here. Still at verse 17, it says, "As it is written, I've made you a father of many nations, before whom he believed, even God, who quickens the dead, and calls those things which are not as though they were." And that's one of God's attributes. God calls things that are not as though they were. And I know there's been a whole bunch of things that's come out about people and what they say, and people having confessions, and people just saying this stuff and saying this stuff over and over and over. Abraham, the only thing Abraham said over and over is what God told him to say. What God had said when God called Abram, the father of many nations. Abraham went away from that point saying, "I'm the father of many nations." And if we're called, like in the New Testament, if we're called the righteousness of God in Christ Jesus, guess what? We should be doing just like Abraham. We should be following Abraham. Whatever God calls us, we should be calling ourselves. Whatever God calls us, we should be calling each other. Whatever God has said. I mean, whatever he's calling us, this can come under many things, but we need to, and when it says that he calls those things which are not as though they were. Well, I can tell you this, I can guarantee you this, anything that God, if God calls something, if it's not that, it's going to end up being that. It will end up being that. If God calls something, if he's calling you, whatever he's calling you, and then Jesus became poor so that we might become rich. I mean, that's what it says in 2 Corinthians chapter 8. Whatever God has called us, if God calls us, and he calls us many things, and everything God calls us it's always a faith statement. Every time, it's always a faith statement. And it's not based initially on what you're seeing. So let's go on here. It says, and then it says Abraham in verse 18, who against hope believed in hope. Now that meant that this is the faith of Abraham. Everything was against what Abraham was believing for. That's the way faith operates. When God says something over and over and over and over, whenever God spoke anything to his people, there was usually all kinds of stuff standing against that, and in many cases it did not look like anything was going to come to pass, that there was no way it could be turned around. I mean, Gideon was of the weak. I mean, Gideon literally said when God came to him, when God called on Gideon, the word to Gideon was, "You're a mighty man of valor." And Gideon was saying, I'm the weakest person of the weakest tribe. But that's not what God was seeing in Gideon. God saw in Gideon that when he believed God, Gideon could be the leader of the entire movement to free the children of Israel. And it says here, Abraham against hope, who no matter what was coming against him and what was screaming in his face, this can't come to pass in your life. What God said, there's no way it's going to work for you. It's never going to work for you. It's worked. Yeah, you've heard all these testimonies. It's this worked for other people. It's not going to work for you. Abraham, with everything that was working against his hope, he continued to believe in hope. And that word hope means joyful in the Greek. That means joyful, confident expectation. Abraham was believing with joyful, confident expectation. So let's go ahead and go down here. And I'm just going to go ahead and read this first. And then I think what we're going to do, let's just go ahead and read it. It says, who against hope, he believed in hope, in verse 18, that he might become the father of many nations, according to that which was spoken, so shall your seed be. Now right here, this is summing up the whole faith process right here. Abraham believed. At the very end of this, it says in verse 18, Abraham was, again, everything that was arrayed against him, he believed, joyfully, confidently expecting. Why? That he might become. Abraham believed that he might become. Wherever you're at right now, we need to take hold of God's words. We need to be willing to trust him. We need to, everything he said he was going to take care of us. He said we're more valuable than the birds of the air. We're more valuable than the flowers out in the field. God clothes them. God feeds the birds of the air. God takes care of all these things. And whatever it is that we're needing, it is always faith. It's always going to get you somewhere and help you to become something. And that's what it says in this verse. And it says, well, I mean, where do you start believing for stuff? Where is it that you establish this, what you're going to believe? It says it right in this verse. It says, according to the word which was spoken. I mean, whatever God has said, that's why we need to get in to this word, and we need to literally know what God's promised us, because every one of these things, if we will believe what these things say, we will become what was spoken. If we will believe what God has said, we will become what was spoken. And that's what that verse is saying right here. So anyway, we're going to pick up on this tomorrow, and when we get into this next verse, I've basically been leading up to this verse. Basically, what I wanted to teach on is in the next verse, and I've just been setting this up. But tomorrow we're going to be looking at what some of the attributes of faith, like when you're okay, so you got God's promise. You got God's promise. You've got this promise that you stand on. You might have had a word come where it says, "Bless the Lord, O my soul, and all that's within me. Bless His holy name." In Psalm 103, bless the Lord and forget not all His benefits, who heals all your diseases. It says He'll forgive all your sins. It says He'll heal all your diseases. Now, if that's the case, how do you start grabbing onto that? And how do you start taking hold so that you can become that? We're going to look specifically, the next verse says exactly what Abraham did. So that's what we're going to be looking at tomorrow. I hope this was a blessing to you. And don't forget this. Jesus is coming back.